Before he even opened his mouth, I knew Richard Hale had decided I wasn't worth the wine he was drinking. And before the check came, I'd already decided how I'd dismantle the empire he was bragging about. It was Thursday night in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of crisp October evening where the air smells like money and wood smoke. Evan had chosen Osteria Luca for the family dinner, though everyone at the table knew his father had picked it. Dark wood paneling, leather booths, muted chandeliers, a place where you order by vintage, not by price. The staff spoke in murmurs and moved like shadows. I adjusted my blazer, stepped past the host's stand, and immediately felt his eyes on me. Richard Hale sat at the center of the table like it was a throne, navy blazer, white shirt, no tie, pocket square folded to military precision. His smile wasn't a greeting, it was a verdict. His daughter Maddie sat 2 seats down, scrolling her phone like she was trying to disappear. His sister Joan nursed a glass of white wine, gaze low. Caroline, his ex-wife, looked like she was bracing for a blow she couldn't see coming. And Evan, my Evan, sat there stiff in his starched button-down, glancing between me and his father as if hoping one of us would vanish. "Ah," Richard said, lifting his glass but not his body. "The gig economy decor has arrived." No hello, no introduction, just a little verbal shiv. My lips curved into a polite smile I've perfected for boardrooms and bad dates alike. "Pleasure to see you too, Richard," I said evenly, sliding into my seat across from him. He swirled his wine. "Tell me, Sarah, still helping TikTok hairdressers with their taxes?" His tone was light, but his eyes were steel. Fascinating. Very democratic. Evan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad," I cut him off with a glance. "It's rewarding," I said, locking eyes with Richard. "Especially when I get to help people who didn't inherit LLCs learn to build their own." A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he smoothed it away. Caroline reached for her water like it was an anchor. Maddie's eyes flicked up, interested for the first time. "That's admirable," Richard said, voice like polished stone. "But scaling requires more than enthusiasm. Governance, controls." He waved his hand. "But I'm sure you have your spreadsheets." I let him talk. People like Richard always reveal themselves if you stay quiet long enough. And while he bragged about his tax-efficient empire, the web of Delaware LLCs, the donor-advised funds, the family office that bore his name, I started drawing my own map. Names, relationships, pressure points. Joan, retired CPA, was pouring her own wine without waiting for the server, an old habit of self-sufficiency. Caroline flinched every time Richard's voice rose. Maddie, Columbia MBA and climate finance analyst, smiled but never interrupted. All minimized, all orbiting him like moons around a planet they couldn't escape. Evan? He just sat there, polite, silent, torn between the man who raised him and the woman he said he loved. Dinner arrived in waves of overpriced plates, sea bass, veal, pasta dusted with truffles like confetti for the rich. I kept my questions harmless on the surface. "How's the foundation doing?" But aimed them like darts. "Oh, splendid," Richard said. "We just funded a new wing at the art museum. Named after Maddie, actually. She didn't even ask." "She didn't," Maddie murmured, eyes on her plate. "It was a surprise." He beamed. "Legacy matters." Joan coughed into her napkin. Caroline's fork paused midair. By dessert, I'd memorized the names of 2 shell companies, clocked the foundation's new address, and watched Maddie's face tighten when her father mentioned reclassifying charitable distributions. Richard thought I was just Evan's girlfriend. He thought I'd flinch. He was wrong. The check came in a black leather folio, discreet cruelty tucked inside. Richard reached for it without looking. "I've got it," he said. Then, with a little flourish, Consider it a gesture toward your industriousness. Thank you, I said, and meant it. Because men like Richard need to pay the check. It reminds them they're in control, that we're all still at their table. But the real game doesn't happen over dinner. It happens in documents and records, in clauses they've forgotten, in the small print obligations they assume no one reads. By the time he signed the slip, I'd already started planning. This wasn't a defeat. This was reconnaissance. When we stood to leave, Caroline touched my arm lightly, as if to say something but thinking better of it. Maddie gave me a quick, unreadable glance. Joan avoided my eyes entirely. Evan squeezed my hand, more out of reflex than conviction. Richard? He just smiled that same verdict smile like he'd dismissed me. I smiled back. Because before he even opened his mouth, I knew he'd decided I wasn't worth the wine. And before the check came, I'd already decided how I'd dismantle the empire he was bragging about. I didn't plan to go digging. Not at first. The thing about truth is, it's patient. It sits quiet until the wrong man says the right thing, and suddenly, it wants to be seen. That was Richard Hale's mistake. He thought monologuing about his tax-efficient empire at dinner would make me feel small. Instead, it gave me my starting point. Back in Seattle, I slipped back into routine. Client calls, financial modeling, the comfortable rhythm of work that had always kept me sane. But I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Not just the insult. Not just the way Richard had used Maddie's name as branding for a foundation she clearly didn't control. No, it was what he said about the reclassified distributions. One of my clients at the time was a boutique fund auditor. Small team, tight-knit, smart as hell. I didn't work on their filings, but we shared a Slack channel. And late one night, I saw a link dropped in a thread with no context. A stray Form 990 for a foundation I didn't recognize. Until I did. The name popped. The Caroline and Richard Hale Charitable Initiative. A shell disguised as sentiment. I clicked it open. IRS Form 992, public, required for nonprofits. Most people ignore them. I don't. I scan the return. Pages of line items, donations, related party expenses. On the surface? Harmless. But then I saw it. $682,000 in management fees, all paid to a company I didn't recognize. Hale Legacy Advisors, LLC. Something flared behind my ribs. I cross-referenced the LLC, registered in Delaware, of course. Where else? No physical address, just a registered agent. But that name, Hale Legacy Advisors, wasn't mentioned once at dinner. Not by Richard, not by Maddie, not even when he bragged about his empire. I dug deeper. SEC filings. Nothing. County records. Quiet. But LinkedIn showed an old advisor who listed Hale Legacy Advisors on their resume for exactly 11 months. Quietly dropped. No press release. That was odd. High net worth family offices love to brag. I cross-checked Hale Foundation grants from 3 years prior. A pattern emerged. Funds dispersed to small charities, but in inconsistent amounts, followed by oddly high consulting fees listed the following year. If I wasn't looking for it, I'd have missed it. But I was looking now. I downloaded every 990 I could find, every single tax year, every grant line item, every management fee. I opened a new spreadsheet and started logging. Dates, amounts, recipients. Then I added a column. Related party red flags. By week's end, I had something close to a map. It wasn't criminal. Not overtly. Everything could be explained with enough plausible deniability. But it smelled wrong. The fees were too high. The disbursements too low. The structure too opaque for a family office supposedly created to preserve the Hale legacy. And all of it, every dollar, was moving through vehicles Richard controlled solo. That was the part that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a governance error. This was intentional, designed to make the family feel involved, while cutting them out completely. I looked at the trust document he'd mentioned. Public probate filings are often redacted, but not always. I found an older version tied to a property transfer back in 2013. Buried in it was a clause most people wouldn't blink at. Fiduciary duty to all beneficiaries. All. Not just Richard, not just Caroline, but Maddie too. Even Joan. That changed everything. It meant Richard wasn't just exploiting a loophole, he was violating the spirit of the trust itself. Maybe even its letter. I called a friend in New York, a former trust litigator turned compliance officer. Walked him through the structure. He paused when I mentioned the related party fees. If it touches a charitable entity, he said, and he's benefiting personally without transparency, that's private inurement risk. The IRS doesn't like that. How bad is that? Bad enough if someone waves a flag in the right direction, especially if the board isn't doing its job. That stuck with me. If the board isn't doing its job, what if it hadn't been allowed to? I went back to the filings, this time looking for who held governance roles. Maddie's name? Absent. Jones? Listed once, years ago, as an advisory member. Caroline was mentioned as a legacy signatory, which meant nothing. Richard's name appeared 15 times. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. All these women, his ex-wife, his daughter, his sister, held legal or moral stakes in this empire. Yet every structure pointed back to him. Every LLC, every board, every dollar. And he had the gall to call me gig economy décor. He thought I'd blink, thought I'd take the insult and fold. Instead, I created a second spreadsheet. I titled it, Governance Gaps. And in that moment, something clicked. This wasn't about money. Not entirely. It was about control. The kind of control that's so absolute, the people around him forget they ever had rights in the first place. I closed the laptop, heart thudding in that steady, familiar rhythm I only get when something big is unfolding. I knew what I had to do next. I had to talk to Caroline Hale. Not as Evan's girlfriend, not even as a consultant, but as a woman who finally saw the machine that had kept them quiet for far too long and was ready to put a wrench in the gears. The first thing Caroline Hale said to me when I showed up on her porch in Westport was, "If this is about Evan, I'm not interested." I smiled. It's not. It's about Richard. That got me through the door. Caroline's home was modern, quiet, and artfully staged, like her life had been wrapped in velvet ever since the divorce. But the corners gave it away. Books stacked unevenly on the coffee table, a family photo half hidden behind a vase, a single glass by the sink. It wasn't loneliness, not exactly. It was something sharper. She poured tea, offered biscotti, and finally said, "Go ahead." I slid the 990s across the table, highlighted, annotated, and silent. She read in silence. Her face didn't move, not until she saw the management company name. Hale Legacy Advisors, she said. That's not a family entity. No, I said. It's Richard's. Her mouth tightened. He said the family office was just being modernized. Less overhead, more efficiency. I nodded. Except all the fees go to him. She kept reading. When she hit the part about the art museum grant in Maddie's name, her hand curled slightly over the edge of the paper. She didn't ask me how I got the documents. She didn't challenge the math. That told me everything. He isolated me, she said softly. During the divorce, I got the houses, the car, the art. He insisted we keep it civilized, but I never touched the trusts. He said they were untouchable. They're not, I said, especially if they're being mismanaged. She laughed once, a small, bitter sound. Of course he's siphoning. Why else pretend we're all taken care of? I need Maddie, I said. And I need Joan. Caroline looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out an old accordion folder. She dropped it on the table. These are the divorce disclosures. He never thought I read them. Inside, exhibits, asset schedules, trust attachments, a few loose pages from board meetings she'd somehow kept. I scanned the headers: trust names, operating agreements, trustee appointments. I felt my breath catch on one page in particular, the Trust Protector Clause. "You're still a beneficiary," I said slowly. "He can't cut you out unless you waive it. Did you ever sign a proxy?" "I don't remember," she said. "But if I did, it was over a decade ago." I nodded. "Then it might be expired." And that's when Caroline's eyes changed. She sat straighter, sharper, like the air had changed in the room. "I thought I had no power left," she said, "but I didn't know what to look for." "You weren't supposed to," I said. We made a list. Maddie first, then Joan. I asked Caroline if she'd reach out to both. She agreed. 2 days later, I met Maddie in the back booth of a juice bar in Soho. She wore athleisure that cost more than most people's rent and looked like she hadn't slept. She hugged me, half-hearted, and said, "Is this about Evan?" "No," I said. "It's about you." I slid her a printout. She glanced at it, then again, slower. "This is—" her voice faltered. "This is the foundation?" "Yes. And the LLC your name isn't on." She read deeper. Her face went still. "My name's not on any of this," she said. "I have an MBA from Columbia. I worked at Blackstone. He still won't let me on the investment calls." "That's not an accident." She exhaled hard. "He told me the foundation was being streamlined, that family voices would dilute the focus." I believed him. "You were supposed to." She looked up. "You think we can fix it?" "I think you already know how to." She tapped the table. "I want oversight, real oversight." "You might already have it," I said, "if we can get Joan on board." Joan lived in New Jersey, a retired CPA, quiet, exacting. She greeted me in a cardigan with pencil marks on the sleeves and a legal pad already in hand. "I always knew he'd come for the governance," she said as I sat down. "He stopped asking me to review board minutes 5 years ago." "He replaced you with a third-party firm in Delaware." "Which he owns," she said flatly. We spent the afternoon going through old board minutes she'd kept. Some were handwritten. Most were signed by Richard alone. All reflected a disturbing pattern: fewer meetings, fewer votes, more managerial discretion. "You were listed as trust protector," I said. "Do you know what that means?" Her eyes lit with something dangerous. "It means I can trigger a governance review." "Then that's our opening." She set the legal pad aside. "What about the proxies?" "Caroline thinks hers expired. Maddie never signed one. 2 other directors are women Richard pushed out years ago. I think they'd come back." Joan looked at me, and I saw the thing Richard had clearly underestimated: the quiet rage of a woman who once kept the books and now saw the pages bleeding red. "I'm in," she said. "He forgot who taught him how to balance a ledger." That night, I sat alone in my apartment, cross-legged on the floor, every document spread in front of me. Caroline had social standing. Maddie had the thesis. Joan had the authority. All of them had been treated as decoration. And now, they were a coalition. The women Richard had underestimated were about to become the ones who took his empire apart. Ledger by ledger, clause by clause. And I was going to help them do it. Most people think money is the engine of power. It's not. The engine is control. Quiet, contractual control. And money is just the fuel. By the time I got back to Seattle, I had all 3 women aligned. Caroline, Joan, and Maddie weren't just emotionally on board. They were structurally relevant. That mattered more. I cleared my week, turned off notifications, and started diagramming. Legal pads, whiteboards, sticky notes taped to the kitchen cabinets. My apartment became a war room. I wasn't just chasing corruption, I was chasing levers, pressure points, clauses, triggers. The Hale Empire, as Richard described it so smugly, was actually a nesting doll of trusts, LLCs, and board proxies. On the surface, it looked like a standard family office: wealth management, charitable giving, succession planning. But once you pulled back the first layer, the truth unraveled. At the top of the food chain sat Hale Holdings, WI, a Wyoming-registered holding company. Why Wyoming? Because it offers anonymity, flexible operating agreements, and zero state income tax. Underneath Hale Holdings, there were 6 Connecticut-based LLCs, each tied to either a real estate investment, a consulting arm, or one of the donor-advised funds Richard loved to brag about. Here's where it got interesting. The operating companies were managed by a separate entity, Hale Legacy Management, the same one receiving those bloated fees from the family foundation. On paper, it looked like a service provider. In practice, it was a siphon. All the LLCs flowed into that one, and Richard owned it outright. But here's the crack in the armor. The LLCs didn't own the family trust. The trust owned them. The Hale Family Trust sat quietly underneath everything. It was the legal owner of Hale Holdings, which meant the trust, not Richard personally, had ultimate voting control. And the trust had something Richard couldn't fully firewall: a trust protector clause. That was Joan. When I called her, she pulled out the original instrument and scanned the boilerplate. Trust protector shall have the authority to call a governance review in cases of potential breach of fiduciary duty. She read aloud. I smiled. That's our clause. Next, I reviewed the voting structure. Richard held most of the proxies, sure, but not all. And proxies are revocable, especially if the original signatory is still alive and hasn't reaffirmed them. Caroline's proxy? Given during the divorce but unsigned in any recent minutes. It was likely expired. Maddie's? Never signed. She'd been deliberately excluded from those decisions. Joan's? Technically unassigned. She never gave hers away. If we moved quickly, we could trigger a special meeting through Joan's authority as trust protector and Caroline's rights as an active beneficiary. Combine that with Maddie's stake and Joan's remaining influence, and we could build quorum. Barely. I built out a schematic. It looked like this. Trust protector, Joan. Can call a governance review beneficiary, Caroline. Can revoke her proxy and assign it anew. Beneficiary, Maddie. Has fiduciary interest, can request transparency management company, Richard. Conflict of interest through related party fees, board members, 2 legacy women. Sidelined by Richard years ago, likely allies. I ran the math 3 times. If Caroline revoked her proxy and reassigned it to Joan, and we persuaded the 2 legacy directors to attend, we'd have a majority. Not just sentimentally, but legally. This wasn't sabotage, it was corporate hygiene. I drafted a memo for internal use only, a compliance roadmap. No accusations, no drama, just facts. Charitable assets being managed by for-profit entities. Management fees showing signs of self-dealing. Beneficiaries excluded from governance despite fiduciary duty. Voting proxies either expired or not legally reaffirmed. I sent it encrypted to Joan and Maddie, then followed with a call. I'm not accusing anyone of a crime, I said. But this structure invites scrutiny. If the IRS saw this, they'd dig, Joan said flatly. They'd dig hard, I confirmed. Maddie spoke next. What happens if we trigger the review and win quorum? We can restructure management, I said. We can install oversight. We can split strategy from operations. Caroline joined the next call. And if Richard pushes back? He will, I said. But if we do this by the book, we don't need his permission. Just his compliance. There was silence for a moment. I could feel all three of them weighing it. Risk versus legacy. Chaos versus clarity. And then Caroline, the one who had lived longest under his shadow, said softly, "I think it's time my granddaughter grew up in a family that tells the truth." That night, I added one more line to my schematic, scribbled beneath the rest in all caps: control ownership. Richard had spent decades convincing everyone that the office was his, but it wasn't. Not entirely. It belonged to the family. And if the women he'd sidelined chose to step into their rights, he couldn't stop them. Not without exposing the very structure he'd spent years trying to hide. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about leverage. And we were finally holding the locks. When people talk about audits, they imagine white gloves and men in suits peering over balance sheets. But the truth is, the most powerful audits don't come from the outside. They come from the people who were never supposed to ask questions. And we were asking questions now. It started quietly. Joan took the lead. With her title as trust protector, she had just enough weight to start requesting old files, minutes from strategy sessions, expense reports from the family office, and investment memos Richard had stopped circulating years ago. She didn't frame it as a confrontation. She framed it as stewardship. "I'm preparing an internal compliance check," she wrote in her email to the family office's general counsel. "Standard fiduciary oversight. I'm sure Richard will understand." No one objected. That was the first sign they weren't expecting resistance. They still thought Joan was just a retired aunt with good manners. Meanwhile, Maddie combed through every investor letter the family office had ever circulated, the ones sent to relatives, to old partners, even to minor stakeholders in the Connecticut real estate LLCs. She was trained for this. She color-coded everything. Her summary doc had 4 tabs, 9 flags, and 1 glaring pattern. Richard had inflated advisory fees on nearly every major deal for 5 straight years, not enough to look criminal, just enough to be profitable. Those fees weren't tied to performance. They were siphoned, off the top, through Hale Legacy Management. That meant charitable funds, beneficiary returns, and even capital gains from trust-owned assets were being skimmed before anyone saw a penny. Caroline's contribution came quietly, but it landed like a hammer. She dug through her divorce archive. Richard had assumed she'd tossed everything once the ink dried, but she hadn't. She still had scanned copies of her marital asset disclosures, including a folder labeled HFO, Initial Governance Setup. Inside was gold. The original board resolution from 2009, signed by Joan and 2 other directors, both women, both pushed out a few years later with what Richard had called strategic restructuring. There was also a clause Richard had likely forgotten, a line requiring annual updates to all voting beneficiaries and a quorum of directors for any change to the management company's charter. There hadn't been quorum in years. I collected the findings and assembled a full memo, 10 pages, bullet-pointed, footnoted, sourced from public filings, trust docs, and internal materials the family never thought would be read again. No theatrics, no accusations, just risk. Private inurement. The foundation was paying above-market fees to a related party entity. Opaque management structure. The family trust's operating companies were managed by a company Richard owned 100%. Lack of fiduciary reporting. Voting beneficiaries were not receiving updates, despite Clause 3.1f of the trust instrument. Failure to maintain board protocol. Quorum requirements not met. Director votes omitted from the record. I didn't say illegal. I didn't need to. In corporate governance, appearance of impropriety is often more powerful than proof. Joan read the memo twice, red-penned it, and sent me a final draft with one comment in the margin. "This is not war. This is compliance." And she was right. We weren't taking Richard down. We were taking the veil off. If he chose to unravel, it would be by his own refusal to adapt. Maddie suggested we retain me formally. "You're no longer just helping me," she said. "You're advising the family office." I paused. "Richard won't like that." "He doesn't have a vote on this," she said. "Not anymore." Joan agreed. We called a quiet vote. Caroline reassigned her proxy to Joan. The two legacy directors, still legally appointed, despite years of Richard's silence, were invited to a confidential review session in New York. They accepted. One of them wrote, "About time." When I walked into that conference room at the law firm on Madison Avenue, it was empty except for Joan, who was reviewing a thick binder with post-it flags every few pages. She looked up. "He never thought we'd read the fine print." "We did," I said. "And now we're acting on it." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing contingency language. What happens if Richard refuses to step down? What happens if he retaliates? What happens if he tries to block Maddie's appointment to the investment committee? Joan wasn't interested in escalation. She wanted an off-ramp, clean, lawful, face-saving. "If he agrees to restructure," she said, "he can stay involved. With limits. And if he doesn't?" She shut the binder. "Then we vote." Back in Seattle that night, I sat with a glass of water, laptop glowing. I looked over everything one last time. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was warning. A chance for Richard to evolve or exit. Quietly. We'd done our part. We hadn't broken rules. We'd enforced them. And the next move? That was his. I flew into New York on a Tuesday. Turbulence hit just as we were descending over the skyline, and it felt appropriate. I wasn't just flying into the city. I was walking into a confrontation disguised as a conversation. One that Richard Hale didn't know he'd already lost. Still, this wasn't about humiliation. That's what made it different. If I wanted revenge, I would have gone public. Sent documents to journalists. Let regulators feast. But that's not what this was. This was a final offer. The meeting took place at his private club on Park Avenue, because of course it did. Leather walls, marble bar tops, some bastardized painting of a revolutionary general hanging above the fireplace. I wore a black pantsuit and carried nothing but my phone and a thin manila folder. Richard arrived 7 minutes late. Not enough to be rude, but just enough to assert dominance. Old game. He sat across from me, calm, composed, the kind of unbothered that only comes from decades of assumed invincibility. "Sarah," he said, like it was a brand he'd outgrown. "What's this about?" I placed the folder on the table. "Governance." He smirked. "You're not on the board." "No," I said. "But Joan is. Caroline is a voting beneficiary. Maddie's never signed a proxy. And you've been running the family office as if that doesn't matter." He opened the folder. Inside, the summary memo. 10 pages of risk, sourced findings, and proposed recommendations. He didn't read it. He just looked at me and said, "You think you understand how this works?" "I do," I said. "Enough to know the trust requires fiduciary oversight. Enough to know Hale Legacy Management is a conflict of interest. And enough to know your proxies are expired, Richard. Legally expired." His eyes narrowed. I kept going. "We're not accusing you of misconduct. We're not threatening litigation. We're giving you an out." He leaned back in his chair. "We?" "The beneficiaries," I said. "Joan, Maddie, Caroline, the legacy directors." "You've poisoned them." "No," I said. "You neglected them. There's a difference." He chuckled. Low, dismissive. "What do you want?" Here it was. The pitch. "We want modernization," I said. "You step down from Hale Legacy Management, convert it into a true family office, not one that pays you fees. Appoint Maddie to the investment committee, let Joan chair governance, and put someone independent in as interim investment chair for 1 year. with ethics guardrails. And who do you suggest for that role? He asked, already knowing the answer. I didn't flinch. Me. He stared at me like I'd grown antlers. I'm not asking for control, I said. I'm asking for sunlight, transparent budgeting, clean reporting, compliance. That's it. He shook his head slowly. Evan warned me you were ambitious. That landed differently. I held his gaze. Is that a problem? He set the folder down. It is when ambition's tied to someone else's money. I smiled. Small, restrained. This isn't your money, Richard. It never was. It belongs to the family. You were the steward, not the owner. His nostrils flared. And now you think you're the steward? No, I said. I think Maddie is. I think Joan is. I think Caroline was. Until you erased her. I'm just the one helping them reclaim it. He laughed. Loud, short. Do you have any idea how many consultants have tried to teach me governance over the years? I'm not teaching you, I said. I'm replacing you. His smile dropped. There it was. The fracture. You'll never get quorum, he said. We already did, I replied. Caroline reassigned her proxy. The 2 legacy directors are attending. Joan called the meeting. Maddie's filing a motion. This is happening. He leaned forward. I built this. No, I said. You extracted from it. And you underestimated the women around you. He stood. You're after the money. No, I said calmly. You're afraid someone else finally isn't. He didn't respond. Just walked out. Jacket buttoned, shoulders square. But he didn't take the folder. And that told me everything. I texted Joan from the curb. He refused the off-ramp. We moved forward. She replied in under a minute. Copy. Notice of meeting will be sent today. Quorum confirmed. Evan called that night. His name lit up my phone as I stared at the ceiling of my hotel room. I answered. I talked to my dad, he said. He thinks you're blowing this out of proportion. Do you? He hesitated. I don't know. It's a lot. Yeah, I said. It is. He exhaled. He said you're making a play. No, I said. I'm giving his daughter her seat at the table. Silence stretched. Evan, I said gently, you need to decide which future you're a part of. Because this one, it's already in motion. He didn't reply, and I knew, right then, that I'd lost him. But I also knew this wasn't about me anymore. It was about structure, stewardship, power returning to the people who were cut out of their own legacy. And if Richard wanted to watch it all unravel, so be it. He had his chance. The notice went out at 9:01 a.m. on a Monday. Subject line, Special Meeting of Hale Family Entities, Governance Review. Joan sent it herself. No legalese padding, no elaborate explanations. Just the clause she was invoking, Section 7.4 of the Hale Family Trust Instrument, and the purpose, to review the structure, operations, and fiduciary alignment of entities controlled by or related to Hale Legacy Management. Richard received it. So did the 2 legacy directors. So did Maddie, Caroline, and every legal party still listed on the trust's beneficiary register. By noon, Richard's private counsel had responded with a thinly veiled threat, something about procedural irregularities and ulterior influence. Joan ignored it. She wasn't breaking the rules. She was enforcing the ones Richard had counted on no one else reading. The proxies were key. We'd confirmed Caroline's was expired. Maddie never signed hers. Joan's had never been assigned. That left Richard's power resting on 2 assumptions. 1, that the women in his family wouldn't organize, and 2, that the people he sidelined would stay silent. Both assumptions were dead now. Caroline formally revoked any previously assumed delegation and reassigned her proxy to Joan. The legacy directors, Carolyn Day, a former foundation program lead, and Diane Feld, once a real estate investment board member, both confirmed their attendance. Maddie submitted her motion to amend the structure of the management company, with signatures attached. The pieces weren't just moving, they were aligned. We scheduled the meeting for Friday, 10 a.m. at a Midtown law firm. The room was neutral ground, glass-walled, conference-style, big enough for the board but small enough to feel pressure. It wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. Joan retained me formally 2 days prior. "We need your findings presented on the record," she said. "This time, not as a girlfriend, as a consultant." I agreed. My name would appear in the minutes as Sarah Nolan, independent advisor to the trust. Not part of the family, not an heir. Just the woman with the documents, the data, and the motive to keep everything clean. We prepped for 3 days straight. Joan printed every board minute dating back to 2015. Maddie built a slide deck, tight, clear, persuasive. Caroline outlined a simple statement, nothing emotional, just a measured reminder that the trust existed for the family, not for one man. And me? I practiced saying the same sentence 5 different ways. We're not alleging misconduct, we're identifying risk. Because that was the shield. The IRS doesn't care if your family hates you, but it cares a lot if your nonprofit foundation is enriching your LLC. Richard must have known it was coming. He didn't respond to the agenda, didn't request a postponement. But his silence was strategic. He was betting we'd blink before he did. We didn't. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning where your breath fogs and every step feels heavier than it should. Maddie showed up early, cardigan over a navy sheath dress, her laptop in hand. Joan arrived in a trench coat and low heels, binder tucked under one arm like a weapon. Caroline wore pearls and no makeup, her version of a statement. I handed out copies of the report, compliance review, summary of related party transactions, proxy confirmations, and a new draft resolution for management restructuring. Nothing revolutionary, just correction. At 9:58 a.m. the door opened. Richard walked in. No entourage, just him. Calm, composed, crisp as ever. He took his seat without a word, unfolded a single page of notes, and stared at the head of the table like it owed him something. Joan called the meeting to order. This is a special governance review under the authority granted by the Trust Protector Clause. All required parties have been notified. Quorum is confirmed. Richard's eyes flicked toward the 2 legacy directors. Carolyn gave him a polite nod. Diane didn't even bother. Maddie presented first. She walked through the structure. The shell LLCs, the routing of advisory fees through Hale Legacy Management, the discrepancy between reported charitable disbursements and actual community impact. She didn't editorialize. She just revealed. Joan followed. She cited the board minutes, how meetings hadn't reflected quorum, how votes had proceeded without full board participation, how Richard had signed off on changes unilaterally. Then Caroline spoke. When I divorced Richard, I accepted that we would not share a life anymore. What I didn't accept was being written out of a structure I helped build. I am still a beneficiary. And I have a granddaughter who deserves a family legacy that's not built on concealment. Richard opened his mouth to reply, but Joan cut him off. Sarah. I stood and presented last. I walked through the 990s, showed how Hale Legacy Management earned $682,000 in management fees in a single year. None of it subject to third-party valuation. I outlined the risk of private inurement. The likelihood that the IRS, should it review the foundation, would raise questions about benefit versus service. I didn't accuse. I demonstrated. This isn't an attack, I said. Final slide up. It's remediation, and the longer the current structure stands, the more risk it poses to the family and the foundation alike. I sat. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Joan folded her hands. We're calling the proxies. she said. And we're moving to vote. Richard looked around the table like he didn't recognize the people sitting at it. Because maybe he didn't. They weren't his accessories anymore. They were his board. You could feel the air change. That moment, after the presentations, before the vote, wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Measured. Cold light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of that midtown conference room while the structure Richard built began to shift under him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hands on the table. That would have been too obvious. Richard Hale was old money smart. He knew the language of restraint. But I saw the way his right hand gripped the edge of his chair. The way his jaw locked when Joan moved to formal business. "This meeting is now in special session," she said. "We will consider proposals to remediate structural risks and amend the management structure of entities under the Hale Family Trust." Richard slid a folded sheet of paper from his folder. "Before we proceed, I'd like to present updated proxy agreements." He held them up, 6 pages, thick with signature blocks. Joan didn't even look up. "None of those are valid, Richard. The proxies on file are either expired, revoked, or superseded by current beneficiary status. I have notarized confirmations. They're not enforceable," she said, voice flat. "Carolyn, Diane, and Caroline have confirmed their positions in writing. Maddie has never delegated voting rights. We have quorum." He turned to his attorney, seated one chair back. The man didn't move. Caroline spoke next. Her voice didn't shake. "This is about more than mismanagement, Richard. This is about legacy. Our granddaughter, your only grandchild, will inherit the world we leave behind. Do you want her to inherit a structure built on extraction?" He didn't respond. Maddie followed, standing to speak. "I've worked in sustainable finance for 6 years. I've seen what real impact looks like. The Hale office could do so much more. We have the capital. We have the tools. But you've used it as a vault, not a vehicle. That stops now." Still, he didn't interrupt. Not out of respect. Out of calculation. He was reading the room, watching every face, weighing every word. But it was too late. The power had shifted. Not in chaos, but in clarity. The room had moved on from him. Joan turned to me. "Ms. Nolan, would you confirm that your findings have been documented and shared with counsel?" "Yes," I said. "All materials have been filed with the record and provided to both legal teams." She nodded and addressed the board. "I move to suspend Richard Hale's management authority over Hale Legacy Management and related entities under the Hale Family Trust, pending remediation. A new role, investment chair, will be created to separate strategy from operations and provide oversight. The position will be independent, with a 1-year term and fiduciary compliance guardrails." "Any second?" "Second," said Caroline. "All in favor?" Hands went up one by one. Carolyn, Diane, Caroline, Maddie, Joan. Motion passes. Richard sat still. Joan continued. "Do we have a nomination for interim investment chair?" Maddie looked at me. "I nominate Sarah Nolan." Joan looked around. "Any objections?" "None." "All in favor?" Again, 5 hands. Motion passes. Just like that. No shouting. No theatrics. Just the kind of silence that follows a seismic shift. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just sat with it. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a transition. From shadow to structure. From unchecked control to shared governance. From extraction to stewardship. Richard finally looked at me. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "You don't know what you've stepped into." I met his gaze. "I do. That's why I stepped in." He stood slowly, straightened his cuffs, picked up his folder. No handshakes, no farewells. He walked out alone. After he left, the room exhaled. Joan rubbed her temple. Maddie looked down at her notes like she wasn't quite ready to believe what had just happened. Caroline blinked a few times, then said, "I didn't think we'd actually do it." We didn't do anything new, I said. We just enforced the terms. Joan leaned back in her chair. Sunlight, she said. That's what this was. Finally. We spent the next hour confirming the next steps. Joan would notify compliance counsel. Maddie would begin drafting an investment thesis. Caroline would oversee a charter review. I would begin the transition plan. Expenses, budgets, staff evaluations, all under a strict ethics policy we would write from scratch. The Hale family office wasn't gone, but it was finally real. By the time I left the building, the sky had cracked open with late morning sun. Not poetic, just clear. For the first time in decades, the structure reflected the family, not just the man who once ruled over it. And we weren't finished yet. He didn't storm in. That would have been too obvious. Richard Hale arrived 23 minutes after the meeting began, dressed like a man who still believed presence was power. Navy suit, silk tie, monogrammed cufflinks, armor for a war he assumed was already won. He held a leather portfolio under one arm and a folded packet of documents in the other. Old proxy agreements, legacy board authorizations, letters of intent from a time when he could still bend the room with a glance. But the room had changed. We were already mid-agenda when the doors opened. Joan was reviewing a policy clause regarding conflict of interest declarations for all future family office employees. Maddie was walking us through an ESG allocation framework for grant-making. Carolyn was taking notes. He paused at the threshold, scanning the table, expecting, perhaps, someone to make space. No one moved. "Excuse me," he said, voice clipped. "I believe this meeting violates standing proxy authority." Joan didn't look up. "You're late, Richard." "These," he said, dropping the packet on the table, "are still binding." "They're not," Joan replied. "You've been informed. All proxies listed have either expired, been revoked, or were never legally authorized. We confirmed with counsel." He turned to Caroline. "You revoked your proxy?" "Yes," she said, voice steady. "Weeks ago." He turned to Maddie. "And you?" "I never gave you one," she said. "You just assumed." The silence was sharper than any shouting would have been. Richard's mouth tightened. "You're making a mistake. I've built this structure to last generations. You don't dismantle a machine just because you don't like the sound it makes." "You didn't build a machine," Maddie said. "You built a siphon." He turned to me. "And you. The interloper." I met his eyes. "Independent chair," I said. "Confirmed by vote. 1-year term. Fiduciary bound." "You're nothing," he said, low. "A spreadsheet nanny with a grudge." "No," Joan said. "She's the person we hired because you failed to do your job." He opened his mouth to speak again, but she cut him off. "Richard, sit down or leave. You're no longer managing member. This is not your meeting." He didn't sit. He stood perfectly still. A man who had lived his entire life as the center of gravity, now feeling the orbit shift. Caroline spoke next. Calm. Surgical. "We aren't cutting you out. You're still a beneficiary. You're still part of the family. But the structure you created violates fiduciary norms, prioritizes self-dealing, and silences legitimate voices. We're correcting that." He scoffed. "You think this will last without me?" Joan flipped a page in her binder. "We're creating a governance charter that will." "And who do you think will manage investment strategy?" he asked, voice hardening. "Maddie? She's never managed a billion-dollar portfolio." Maddie didn't flinch. "We're bringing in external advisors, real ones who aren't on your yacht list." Richard took a step toward the window, jaw clenched, then back to the table. "I demand a revote," he said. "There's no motion on the table," Joan said, "and no voting authority left to you." "So this is what you're doing?" he asked. "A cabal of women with old grudges?" "No," I said, standing. This is what happens when the people you minimized learn how your empire works and start reading the fine print. Joan gave me a nod. We'll proceed, she said. Our next item: adoption of the investment policy statement. She turned to me. Ms. Nolan? I passed around the finalized IPS, 28 pages of risk controls, allocation mandates, compliance review structures, and grant-making guidelines. It separated operations from strategy, banned internal self-dealing, mandated quarterly reports. It made abuse difficult. Richard scanned it. You expect me to live under this? No, I said. We expect you to follow it. He shook his head, slow and bitter. You've all made a very expensive mistake. No, Joan said quietly. We've prevented one. The vote proceeded. All in favor of adopting the IPS, 5 hands. None opposed. Motion passed. Richard looked around the room one last time. Then he gathered his documents, said nothing, and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. The silence left in his wake said enough. After the door clicked shut, no one spoke for several seconds. Then Maddie exhaled, long and slow. I didn't think he'd come, she said. He had to, Caroline replied. He couldn't stand not being in the room. Joan stood. And now it's not his room anymore. I collected the signed IPS, slid it into the binder, and closed it with a quiet thud. On the front cover, I'd taped a single label: Hale Family Office, Chair, Sarah Nolan. There was no parade, no champagne, no viral headline, just a glass door in Greenwich, newly etched: Hale Family Office Chair, Sarah Nolan. We didn't fire anyone. We audited. We restructured. We did what Richard never imagined possible. We turned the legacy from a vanity project into a real institution. Quietly, clinically, in broad daylight. The office space changed first. Gone were the locked filing cabinets and opaque reporting lines. We replaced them with open book accounting and modular workstations. Everyone got access to the same dashboards: grants, expenses, red lines. Transparency wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was policy. I hired a forensic CPA, someone outside the family, no ties. She rebuilt 5 years of ledger history and confirmed what we already suspected. Over $3.2 million in management fees had gone to Richard's shell company, often just days after charitable funds were deposited. No clawback, no litigation. But we did amend the trust's internal policy. No entity controlled by a current beneficiary may receive compensation without unanimous board approval and independent market benchmarking. Richard could keep what he took, but he'd never take again. Maddie drafted the new investment charter, a climate and community-forward thesis that allocated 15% of assets toward sustainability-focused funds, 10% toward community reinvestment, and carved out a segment for experimental philanthropy. She chaired her first committee meeting with Joan beside her. Watching them, I felt something shift, not just in structure, but in story. This was the real revenge, not punishment, replacement. Caroline, too, found her place. She oversaw the new family charter, a living document that outlined roles, rights, and boundaries. It included an education clause for minors, mandatory governance training for adult heirs, and an ethics rider that required all beneficiaries to acknowledge fiduciary duty, annually, in writing. The family had never had a rulebook. Now it had a constitution. Richard? He stayed silent for weeks. No formal challenge, no press leaks, just retreat. We learned later that his personal counsel advised against a public dispute. Too risky, too much documentation, too many women who could speak. Clearly, factually, legally. Instead, he was given a memo. 1 page, signed by all 5 board members. Effective immediately. All discretionary expense accounts, club memberships, and travel perks associated with Hale Legacy Management are terminated. He'd spent decades using those perks as currency: airfare, dining, suites, and business development events that were more about ego than enterprise. Now, they were gone. Not with fanfare, not with vengeance, with policy. Evan called once, just once. He didn't apologize at first. He danced around it, told me he didn't know the full story and that family stuff is complicated. I let him talk. Then I told him we were done. Not angrily, not even sadly, just done. Because if you stand by when power is abused, when your father siphons legacy into luxury and you say nothing, you don't get to stay in the room when it gets repaired. I didn't expect you to pick sides, I told him, but I did expect you to stand up. He sighed. You still love him? No, I said, but I love what he was supposed to be a part of. And now? He isn't. After that, he didn't call again, and I didn't miss him. We held our first official board retreat that spring. Not in Palm Beach or Aspen, but at a restored inn in the Catskills. Everyone flew coach, no catered dinners, just working sessions, long walks, and the kind of hard conversations that no one had dared start before. We planned the next 10 years, what assets to divest, what grants to increase, what legacy to actually live by. On the final day, Joan brought out the original trust instrument, the one she'd reviewed on paper years ago when Richard still included her in meetings. She passed it to Maddie. Your turn, she said, but this time, with your eyes open. Maddie didn't cry. She didn't break down. She signed the annual beneficiary letter, tucked the document into her folder, and nodded. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just a name on a statement. She was a steward. My 1-year term as chair will expire soon. I won't renew. That was never the point. The point was transition, infrastructure, a new map for a legacy that finally belonged to more than just one man's will. There's a quiet kind of revenge in watching an empire correct itself. Not with fire, but with facts. Not with chaos, but with clarity. I'll never forget that first dinner. The wine, the insult, the smirk. And I'll never forget what followed. Because when Richard Hale looked across that table and saw a woman he thought was decoration, he gave her everything she needed to tear the whole damn thing down.